for being really on time. So it is our immense privilege, of course, to welcome today and for this week and the next, this year's Pierre and Marie-Anne Sorel Writer in Residency at the Department of French and Francophone Studies. We started this residency in 2017 thanks to the generous support of Pierre Sorel, who's here with us tonight, a former student here at Brown and an active promoter of French and Francophone culture in the greatest Boston area. Under his auspices, we have been able to invite over the years Evelyne Pouillot, Angela Kaya, Edouard Louis, Gaël Auvier-Gli, Jean-Christophe Bailly, Georges Duverman, and most recently Vinciane Després. So thank you, Pierre, for making it possible for us to bring such beautiful writers and thinkers at Brown. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Mohamed Amar-Mizan. I teach here. I'm the Robert Gale Noyes Assistant Professor of Humanities. And today I have a big problem. The problem is that Philippe Descola needs no introduction, and yet I have to present him. So Philippe Descola is Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at the Collège de France, gold medal winner of the CNRS, so the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in France, member also of the Legion of Honor, and member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the British Academy. I could go on and on, the list is long. Initially, Philippe Descola was directeur d'études at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. Descola was elected afterwards to the chair held by Lévi-Strauss and then by Françoise Héritier at the Collège de France, which was renamed by him the chair for the anthropology of nature. In 2005, if I'm correct, he published what has now become a classic work in the social sciences and humanities, which is Beyond Nature and Culture, which I should point out is now 20 years old, I think, right?
Yes.
So today I will not present his biography in a conventional manner, but I will attempt to unfold the reasons for his importance to the discipline of anthropology as well as for the humanities more broadly. And if the idea of Francophone humanities that we defend in this department has a meaning, then his work is certainly a central embodiment of it, because it shows why the intersections between the empirical depth of social sciences and the conceptual rigor of philosophy is so crucial. Indeed, Descola was first and foremost trained in philosophy, but later became an anthropologist, partly, but not only, under the influence of Claude Lévi-Strauss. And it is in this capacity that he is the heir to an intellectual lineage, that of Lévi-Strauss, but also of Bourdieu and people like Bruno Latour. This lineage has never subscribed to narrow positivism and has distinguished itself for that very reason. It is also a lineage that has shaped the theoretical language of the social sciences and humanities for so long now. And if we're talking about animism and ontology again today, it's also thanks to Philippe's work. I should add maybe that if Latour wrote that we never have been modern, it's also based on a very long discussion between them that also was premised on the critique of the concept of nature that Philippe began in his thesis in the Society of Nature. I must say I met Descola during a conversation we had at the Collège de France, where he was kind enough to respond to some hypotheses, even critical ones. This conversation happened at the crossroads of continental philosophy and anthropology, but at the very center, once again, of what we call the humanities here. This invitation to Brown is also an invitation to pursue such conversation, as well as to broaden it by involving the entire Brown community. And it's very nice to see so many of you today. We are also going to pursue this conversation on Saturday, and we also have the honor and privilege to have here Anne-Christine Taylor, also an anthropologist, who will be discussing with with my colleague Tangam Rabindranatham, Philippe Descola, and myself. So if you're around, please welcome. You're welcome to participate in that discussion. Tonight, depending on if you're European or American, I don't know, Descola is developing a new sequence, a new moment of his work, yet unknown to most Anglophone readers, and which gave birth to a book titled Forms of the Visible. The book will be published in November by Polity Press, and I signal the publication of his Tanner lectures given in 2023 at UC Berkeley and published by Oxford University Press now under the title Politics of Worlding. So these books will be published very soon. Okay, the crucial question, I think, of Forms of the Visible is if ontologies are the filter through which we organize the furniture of the world and then make worlds, how can they also act as schemes of figuration? Hence, this Golas paradoxical formula which structures today's talk, the title of today's talk, Figuring the Invisible. But I'm already getting ahead. So without further ado, I ask you to please give a warm regard and warm welcome, to our Pierre and Marie Sorel writer in residence, Philippe Descola. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohamed, for this introduction. I would like to extend my warmest thanks also to Mohamed, Virginia Krauss, for this invitation to Brown, whom I did not know before, my first time in Brown. I've been in a number of Ivy League universities over the years, but for the first time in Providence. So I'm quite happy to be here, where I have some friends whom I met before. And I'll try to answer the question that Mohamed ended his talk with. How do we figure the invisible? For 80,000 years, humans have been making images, only a tiny fraction of which can be considered art in the sense understood in Europe since the 18th century, namely as being characteristic of works belonging to the fine arts, those that are admired in museums, churches, and art dealers, and which modern reproduction techniques have spread the taste to the four corners of the world, though that we learn to love and sometimes to fear at school and at home. So let's see if this works. Yes, it does. Whatever the diversity of visual art genres, whether they conform to or challenge academic traditions, whether they are expressed in 2 or 3 dimensions, whether they reflect an aspiration to imitate as closely as possible what they represent, or question any reference to the outside world, this hubbub of forms, colors, and media is nevertheless unified, not so much by a common purpose, an ambition that historians and philosophers have unceasingly torn to shreds, as by its source in a region of the planet, Western Europe, where art flourished and where, belatedly, an attempt was made to write its history in order to better define its contours, most often by default. Nevertheless, despite the dizzying plurality of its local traditions, this small province of images we call art is only a tiny island in the ocean of figurations before the age of art, or on its periphery, to which archaeologists, anthropologists, and even a few historians have paid attention. Reducing the ocean to an island would make little sense. Firstly, because, as we have just said, no one agrees on what art is, especially since Alfred Stieglitz exhibited Marcel Duchamp's urinal in his New York gallery in 1917, but also and above all because of the immense scope of the operations covered by images, whether they are considered artistic or not. Most of them, those that escape the authority of art history, are not intended to offer a faithful copy of an object or scene, to bear witness to the canons of beauty, to spread an edifying message, or to recount a salient episode in the lives of well-known figures, real or imaginary. Despite the variety of what they depict and the means they use to do so, all iconic images, regardless of where in the world they come from or when they were made, share the same purpose: to expose to our gaze what is not usually there. Whether this absence is exhibited in an object that has disappeared forever, or is visible in other places and under other circumstances, whether it is already known or yet to be discovered in its substitute, whether it even exists elsewhere in concrete form, or only in the inner world of those who represent it. The peremptory nature of my proposal to represent is to make an absence present invites an objection familiar to anthropologists. Can we really be sure that this mission assigned to images is universal? Could it not be the effect of a local tradition that assigns as its primary purpose to figuration the act of making the absent present? A tradition that Europe inherited from the ancient civilizations of the Near East and then enriched with Christian debates on the Incarnation. This tradition is certainly deeply rooted in the Western and Mediterranean world, to such an extent that some of its manifestations have been regarded as invariants of images, without exception. This is, for example, what Hans Belting asserts when, in the preamble to his ambitious anthropology of images, he writes that, I quote, "The experience of death has been one of the most powerful driving forces behind the human production of images." According to him, the main function of images is to preserve the memory of the dead. A proposition he supports by asserting that the oldest images of humanity are images of the deceased. However, while the desire to compensate for the absence of a dead person by substituting an image is not unknown beyond the Mediterranean region, it is by no means as universal as Belting seems to assume. Images of individualized dead people can certainly be found where there is ancestor worship, for instance, in pre-Hispanic Andean cultures, West Africa, and parts of Polynesia and Melanesia. The situation in Asia is mixed. In ancient China, for instance, effigies of the deceased and their entourage were buried and therefore did not serve as reminders for the living. Hinduism goes further by rejecting images of the deceased, whom funeral rites are intended to separate and remove from their loved one, so that they become, in the words of Charles Malamud, faceless dead. Australian Aborigines also do not keep images of their dead, and this practice seems to be unknown in the lowlands of South America, northern North America, autochthonous northern North America, the circumpolar region, Siberia, and among most of the indigenous people of insular Southeast Asia. Let us therefore assume that images are not used everywhere to make an absent person present, if, and the if is important here, if by absent we mean only a dead person. And it is also from these regions and periods that Europeans have incorporated into their civilizations over the last few centuries, Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome, that we have acquired the habit of considering normal the presence in public places of effigies representing beings that are difficult to see in everyday life, such as gods and rulers, making Isis and Pharaoh, Jupiter and Augustus visible is, beyond the conventions adopted for their representation, delegating to objects the function of making present not so much the person of a god or a monarch as the tangible expression of their power and ubiquity. In stone in general, they represent in the sense that a diplomat represents, that is, the emanation of his country embodied in another place, each of their manifestations being like a small embassy that vividly recalls the extent of their agency, mandated in relays visible to all. And yet, once again, if we continue our investigation beyond the Tigris, the Nile, and the Pillars of Hercules, the courts of gods and sovereigns is far from universal. Many civilizations do without leaders, let alone monarchs and deities demanding tribute, worship, and sacrifice. Consequently, they have no need to produce incarnations, since what they would refer to is not even conceivable. It was in Europe, finally, that the practical question of giving visible form to a reality that was, in principle, unrepresentable, the union in the body of Jesus between the human form and the divine word, arose most acutely. Let us first highlight this distinctive feature of Christianity, which stems from Judaism and more generally from a Mediterranean theory of poiesis that sees the human body and the world as the result of creation ex nihilo. Present in both Plato and the Old Testament, the metaphor of the potter emphasizes the idea that both cosmogony and anthropogony result from an imposition of a form on inert matter. This has two consequences: the preponderance of an individualized intentional agent as the cause of the genesis of beings and things, and the radical difference in ontological status between the creator and what he produces. This could be this could not be further from the way Amazonian peoples, for instance, conceive of the advent of humans, animals, and plants as metamorphoses that are always reversible, self-generated, or triggered inadvertently from a profusion of beings that have always existed. To this voluntary and deliberate nature of creation, shared by Mediterranean polytheisms and monotheisms, is added this biblical curiosity. Although man is dependent on his maker, as is every product on its producer, he inherits the distinguishing mark of having been made in his image. This relationship of imitation between the prototype and the copy it makes of itself is generally interpreted by theologians as metaphorical, since God, being immaterial, cannot lend an image of his body to an object outside himself. More subtly, an exegete such as Procopius of Gaza, for Gaza was, before being wiped out under bombs, was a seat of a very lively intellectual tradition. Procopius of Gaza pointed out in the 6th century that every image is an idea made tangible by the particular organization of the matter used to express it. In this sense, the human body can be seen as a reflection of God's body, not in the literal and absurd sense that it resembles Him, but because the matter of which it is made was endowed by God with special dispositions expressing His own attributes. It thus resembles the divine soul in the same way that the eye, through the liveliness of its gaze, bears witness to human intelligence, which itself was created in the image of God's intelligence. The human eye, the material organ of bodily sensation, can therefore be understood as an image of a divine quality. In short, something of God becomes visible in the human body if we accept that God is like an abstract model from which particular aptitudes are incorporated into animate matter. Christ, God made man, reminds us that this process is not limited to the moment of creation, that the unrepresentable is capable of receiving a tangible expression in a human body that is necessarily imperfect, since it must consent to its own death in order to live again for eternity. So, from a Christianity that slowly matured over the Middle Ages and was spurred on by the quarrel between iconoclasts and iconodules, the Western conception of the image thus acquired three exceptional features that the visual arts could not help but inherit when they appeared: the creative work of the artist, the incommensurability between the creator and the product of their creation, and the image as the embodiment of an idea or principle. Through those characteristics, which reinforced the ancient tradition of mimesis, an understanding of the image as the material objectification of a reality external to itself was consolidated. And from this dual legacy, a singular antinomy flourished. How can one best reproduce a model whose physical instantiations will always be imperfect? For the image, understood as a substitute for the incarnation, is both an index, the trace of God, and an icon, the allusive imitation of the unrepresentable being that shaped it. This dual nature, index and icon, fuels the West's ambiguity towards images, which are both a means of approaching a suprasensible ideal untainted by corruption, and a means of capturing the ideal's deceptive reverberations. The theme of the incarnation seeks to dissolve this antinomy by partially bridging the ontological gulf that separates the creator from the created, thus establishing an affinity between divine presence and the human body, even pushing art in the direction of a search for worldly transcendence. So the fundamental role played by the problem of the incarnation in Western art in recent centuries, and the central function performed since antiquity by the representation of the dead, divinities, and sovereigns, do not imply, however, that the question of the incorporation of distant or invisible beings does not also arise in other figurative traditions. It undoubtedly arises in a different way than in the European and circum-Mediterranean tradition, but it arises nonetheless. For embodying an absent presence is indeed the function assigned to images everywhere, but it is a function nuanced by the nature of what is given to be seen, by the identity of those empowered to make it visible, by the means they use to give substance to what they represent, and by the circumstances in which the entities depicted become active in the networks that host them, or of which they become the organizing axis. Some of these images make visible beings that are usually unseen: spirits, deities, meta-persons of all kind, or that have no other form and perhaps no other existence than that of the concrete object where they are believed to be present: monoliths, mountains, trees, etc. Others reproduce the infinity of the infinitely diverse clues left on the surface of the world by entities that were once sovereign and whose form is now impermanent, so that their agency may be reawakened. Traces of foundations or ancestral journeys restored on various media or reproduced step by step. Still others attempt to reveal feelings and states of consciousness, atmospheres and desires, resonances between the viewer and the sensible world, or between elements specific to it, like so many investigations or precepts on the state of things or the way to conduct one's life. Installations and cosmograms, landscapes, scale models, etc. Finally, other images, which are more familiar to Europeans, depict human beings, sites, organisms, buildings, and events, sometimes ordinary to those who look at them, sometimes described in stories handed down by tradition, sometimes invented by the image maker, and yet recognized as familiar or plausible by their audience. In addition to being part of the everyday furnishing of the various worlds inhabited by humans, images also make it possible to represent the usually invisible beings that populate these worlds, thus giving them a plausible consistency. The disparate entities that religious imagination brings into beings in all parts of the earth and in the celestial borders that surround them, spirits, local genies, ghosts resulting from an unnatural death, angels and demons, chthonic deities, or the Christian God, have this particular characteristic of generally being immaterial beings aspiring to receive material expression. In this sense, figuration is a metaphysical operation, since it brings into existence, in a body, invisible beings whose existence we sense, or who leave behind tenuous traces of their presence, insufficient, however, to prove that they are indeed as we imagine them to be. Figuration is therefore a technique for establishing what is not normally visible, complementing, at least for iconophiles, the usual methods of establishing numinous entities through speech, through music, through ritual, and through dreams. However, these entities, awaiting objectification, differ in their intrinsic characteristics, just as the means of making them visible in images and activating them for those who attribute power to them also differ. In order to better understand the specificity of art before art, and perhaps of art after art, an inventory of the various kinds of incarnation is therefore useful. I will attempt to illustrate another way of looking at art, not by identifying genealogies and breaks in figurative styles and artists, not by studying the philosophical, social, or economic circumstances in which a particular image maker worked, not by examining the aesthetic or psychological motivations behind figuration, but rather by addressing the variety of ontological furniture with which humans surround themselves and the qualities they attribute to them as seen in the images they create. The objects that an image perpetuates are innumerable, of course. First, they are the ephemeral ones, the 3 apples in a fruit bowl that will be gone in a few days, the train speeding through the fog on a bridge over the Thames that will never be seen again in the same way against the same sky. Absent because no one has ever seen them, whether they are imaginary or no visual evidence of their existence remains, are also those characters that images illustrate or commemorate. The 3 wise men in all the exoticism of their costumes, Hercules in one of his exploits, Ulysses with the souls of the wind. But it is not these absentees, the raw material of Western painting, that I wish to concern myself with here. Rather, it is the absentees from an incarnation it is the absentees whom an incarnation makes plausible because their presence is truly necessary for the unfolding of life. Apart from the God of monotheistic religions who became nature in later times, these beings, to whom only images can confer a presence and whom humans sought to embody long before the birth of art, can be divided into 3 categories within which they sometimes coexist: spirits, deities, and antecedents. I've already mentioned them in other texts, but I would like to explore their characteristics in greater depth. Let's start with spirits. They are typical of those parts of the world, the Amazon, the Subarctic, Siberia, certain regions of Southeast Asia, where it is said that almost all beings, animate or inanimate, possess a spirit or soul of the same nature as humans. Almost all animals and many plants, but also blowguns, sleds, and hunting poisons are spirits, clothed with their proper body clothing, which coexist with races of spirits of very diverse appearances, generally living in families with their own languages and customs, much like humans. For every spirit, whether it has a sui generis appearance or is embodied in an animal, plant, or artifact, is endowed with a distinctive material envelope different from that of other forms of existence, which allows it to occupy certain milieu and perform certain types of action, in particular to obtain sustenance. Every incarnation of a spirit, a jaguar, an eagle, a pot, a flickering shadow cast on a wall by a domestic fire, is therefore a person endowed with a spirit, but this spirit may be that of another body, since spirits can move between bodies, which are simply garments that can be donned and sometimes discarded, for example, during the wandering of the soul that dreams allow. Some spirits are reluctant to show themselves in their ordinary bodily form, while others are true ghosts, spirits of the dead, deprived of bodies and sentient life. They then manifest themselves as clues rather than icons, through sounds, imprints, touches, objects moved. A body, sometimes borrowed, sometimes gone, sometimes imitated, is therefore the image par excellence of spirits. And which is a paradox in a Western context. And this is what throughout the animist archipelago, where spirits intermingle with humans, the latter strive to represent. The implementation of a spirit, its physical objectification, therefore takes place at all times in the phenomenal world, since everybody is a spirit, but it can also be produced by humans when they represent the bodily garment of the spirit whose presence they seek to ensure. Embodying spirits essentially consists of making their subjectivity visible, while fixing in a particular body, an animal body, or that of a particular race of spirits. The carved wooden mask of the Yupik of Alaska are famous for offering an elegant solution to this dual requirement. Here's another. No, it's. Yes. During winter rituals, they were used, these Yupik masks, to embody the souls of animal peoples in the communal house, where they were welcomed with gratitude for giving their bodies to hunters so that humans could feed themselves. Whatever species they represented, usually with great realism, as you can see on this mask, the mask figured the soul of the animal by inserting a small human face in a medallion on the forehead or in place of the eye, a way of bringing the interior to the surface of the body by giving it the appearance of the paradigm of all interiority, that which humans are endowed with. The human face was not intended to anthropomorphize the animal, but to personify it, that is, to make it a person. And the mask did not serve to hide the human appearance of the dancer wearing it. Quite the contrary. Partially naked, the dancer made no attempt to conceal his identity and his human appearance. The embodiment of animals was, in a sense, spiritual. It was achieved through the mediation of a human intentionality that adopted the animal's point of view. That is, by exhibiting an animal intentionality without being alienated by it. The dancers retain full control of their inner selves and function as sort of filters of the animal's point of view, thanks to the objectifying power of the mask. Characteristic of animism, the complex variation of relationships between an inner identity and a bodily form finds its fullest expression in metamorphosis, one of the means by which subjectivities of the same nature, but imprisoned in incommensurable bodily forms, can communicate beyond physical obstacles. Metamorphosis is not a change of form as sung by Ovid. It is a relationship between two beings who are led to modify the position of observation imposed on them by their respective bodies in order to present themselves to each other from the perspective according to which the other sees itself. So humans no longer see animals as they see themselves in everyday life, but as animals see themselves, that is, as humans. Dreams throughout the animist archipelago and trances induced by psychotropic drugs in the Amazon allow this sleight of hand that the images used in rituals strive to reproduce. This is particularly true of the transformation mask of the northwest coast of the American Pacific, which allow for a spectacular switching effect thanks to mechanisms that open side flaps. They then reveal behind an animal face visible on the outside a human face that signals the interiority of the animal represented. And this is a particularly complex case because it's a three-tiered metamorphosis, no? I don't have the time to enter into the description of what it refers to. The embodiment of animal spirits sometimes takes more literal forms. This is the case in the Amazon, where rather than making images of human or animal bodies that resemble their models, Native Americans have instead sought to transform human bodies into images, borrowing motifs and attributes from animal bodies. This simply involves adding to the human body parts taken from birds, mammals, reptiles, and insects: feathers, down, teeth, fur, bones, claws, beaks, elytra, etc. Described as mere ornaments by dealers of primitive art, these added parts are in fact a means of augmenting human bodies so that they regain the physical fullness of a bygone era. Indeed, a bygone era, sorry. Indeed, before the division into species recounted in myths, all living beings had the same type of body, combining all the abilities now distributed among the various species. By recovering from animal bodies certain features of the original body that they too have lost, humans seek, in a sense, to reincarnate themselves, that is, to capture for themselves a portion of the experience of the world that other species set in motion through their particular physicality. Let us turn now to another form of absence that humans are trying to make present: deities. They are sometimes confused with spirits because they too express desires, displeasures, and intentions, and they too behave most of the time like persons. However, they are less unpredictable than spirits in their behavior and in the ways they choose to manifest themselves. This is because their sphere of action is more limited, and they are more closely linked to social units, lineages, castes, villages, as well as to places and times when humans expect them to exercise the particular powers they are believed to possess, bringing rain, raising crops, promoting the prosperity of a community. Here are some examples of deities from different parts of the world. Unlike spirits, which are alter egos that must be charmed, persuaded, or coerced, deities are more distant, halfway between the immanence of animist spirits, which are omnipresent in everyday life, and the implacable transcendence of the God of monotheists. In contrast to the latter, however, who extends his grace everywhere and receives everywhere the prayers of his followers, deities are more localized, even when, as is the case with saints in Christianity and Islam, their veneration is part of a more encompassing monotheistic cult. Pilgrimages to the tombs of saints in the Muslim world and appeals to the specialized powers of particular saints in the Catholic world are examples of how the religions of the book have been diverted towards the establishment of intermediary entities that are more accessible to the faithful, intercessors whose particular skills, sometimes well attested for a particular group, bring them closer in this sense to the deities that are typical of polytheistic religions. Just as the domain of expertise of deities is specialized, the geographical area where they exercise their power is generally limited. It is in the well-identified sites where they reside that they are revered and worshipped, that offering and sacrifices are made to them at prescribed times, and that they are expected to grant the wishes of the devotees in return. The expectations of the latter are generally more confident than those of the people who deal with spirits, beings that are known to be very capricious. This assignment of deities to clearly identified places becomes part of their essence when they are associated with or incorporated into an element of the landscape, into an image or into a building, a mountain, a monolith, a spring, a statue, a temple, a shrine, or a tomb. Finally, the dual attachment of a deity to a site and to a human group that controls it, and from which the liturgical specialists responsible for celebrating it may come, generally limits the disposition of its benefits or the effectiveness of its intercessions to the groups of humans and non-humans that are closest to it, both spatially and socially. Giving forms to deities is of paramount importance, since they are expected to play their part in the civic life of the communities that attribute powers to them, to visibly accept or even to refuse what is asked of them, to offer guidance on the resolution of an ongoing conflict, or on the election of one of their followers to office, all tasks that are best accomplished through physical action. Moreover, as iconodules have clearly understood, devotion is expressed more vigorously, perhaps even more sincerely, when it can be directed toward an image, a quasi-person, with whom one can empathize and share one's feeling. However, the autonomy attributed to deities is exercised differently from that granted to spirits. Images of spirits, which are essentially masks, with or without costumes, and human bodies wearing animal prostheses, are dependent on the people wearing the disguise who bring them to life episodically in rituals. They are objectified in borrowed bodies that deceive no one, except perhaps children, and whose function is primarily to provide a support for the embodiment of an interiority. Divinities, on the other hand, take the form of idols in the primary sense of the term, that is to say, in the images made of them. The power with which they are imbued and the autonomy with which they are thought to be invested are permanently deposited in them, by contrast with spirits. Not because they manifest an interiority like spirits, incarnated in images, but because they are assigned a social role conceived by analogy with that which a human being can fulfill. They reside in a place, are bound by conventions, and their life as idols is subject to a calendar and to repetitive ritual obligations. They can also serve as a vehicle for an intimate sense of identification, a source of personal attachment, deference, love, and even respectful apprehension, which spirits hardly can inspire. Because of the roles they are publicly assigned, they can also act as intermediaries between human communities and their individual and collective aspirations, becoming messengers, propitiators, and sometimes scapegoats. Deities are therefore quite humans in the behaviors attributed to them. They are hungry and thirsty, happy or angry, jealous of one another, etc. And this is because they are expected to act in accordance with the collective project of a social group of which they become prominent figures. This involves ensuring the prosperity of this group, protecting it from misfortune, and watching over the part of the cosmos where its destiny has placed it. This often requires the deities to agree among themselves and cooperate with humans in order to carry out the missions entrusted to them by their followers. This is why they are expected to follow decipherable rules of behavior and to consent to being cared for in accordance with these rules. In ancient Egypt or in contemporary India, they are fed, washed, clothed, taken for walks, and treated with the deference they are due, as if they were fully living, functioning members of the socio-cosmic collective of humans and non-humans over which they exercise their power. However, an idol's ability to perpetuate its collaboration with those who worship it and thus justify its existence can only be strengthened by ostensible demonstrations of its agency. The incarnation of deities, the visible expression of their autonomy, often involves a public display of what makes them resemble humans. Among the many examples that come to mind, I will mention just one from northwestern India. In the mountainous region of Himachal Pradesh, local deities are worshipped in two avatars. In their temple, in the form of an image depicting their attributes, and in a mobile form carried by their devotees along ceremonial routes. For this latter purpose, small palanquins are used, whose superstructure, surmounted by a richly decorated circular canopy, is lined with embroidered fabrics on which masks made of precious metals are arranged, one of which represents the deity. Unlike the image preserved in the temple, the incarnation of the deity is not based here on an iconic resemblance to a supposed prototype, but on its manifest behavior. The highly flexible poles supporting the palanquin cause it to sway in an apparently uncontrolled manner whenever the men carrying it move, which the devotees interpret as a coded language, enabling them to enter into dialogue with the deity. If it does not move when a request is made, it is indifferent or indisposed. Disorderly agitation is a sign of anger, while lively rhythmic movements indicate satisfaction, etc. In short, these beings, considered to be true local personalities who hold land rights, administer justice, set the dates of the agricultural calendar, and meddle in most aspects of the lives of their devotees, come into existence through a gestural incorporation that confirms their social dimension and gives it the weight of lived experience. Third category of numinous being, what I call antecedents. These are the entities to which one must go back in time in order to understand, accept, and justify what is important in the present state of affairs. Antecedents give rise to the properties that characterize a social group. They are the concrete determinants of its identity and prerogatives, much more limited to a territory and a group of descent than are deities. They manifest themselves in two forms: totems and ancestors. These two forms have often been confused, wrongly, insofar as both types of entities provide localized social segments with their own collective personality and ontological identity, but they do so by very different means. Ancestors are meta-persons of a special kind, humans in the ascending generation, neither quite dead nor quite alive, on whom their descendants depend for almost most aspects of their daily existence. The order and values that govern their lives, the advantages they enjoy, the means of subsistence available to them, their status, rights, titles, the name they can claim, the rights they have the right and duty to perform, their very person, in that this person is composed of principles, substances, sometimes a destiny, which come from their ancestors, and those who before them begot them. The clearest expression of this sovereignty that the not quite dead exercised over the not fully living, not fully because they become real persons only when they become themselves fully ancestors, can be seen whether humans worship ancestors as in China or Africa, for example. In this case, the ancestors are close relatives, still alive in memory and recognizable in appearance, not distant figures with an almost legendary status who are said to be the origin of clans and tribes. The ancestors who matter are individualized and named, very often embodied in images, enthroned in domestic and lineage shrines, their constant coexistence with their descendants, making the perpetuation of their empire over them more plausible. The ancestor shrines of the Mande and Voltaic region of West Africa perfectly illustrate what is expected of the embodiment of this type of antecedent. They are found in parts of houses and shrines populated by wooden sculptures representing adult men or women standing or sitting in a hieratic and impersonal attitude. Rather than ancestors recognizable by their facial features, they are archetypes of individuals characterized by the stage of life and a status. Among the lobby, for instance, the head of the household keeps in a room called the Chamber of Powers the effigy of a maternal ancestor whose name is known and whose qualities he has inherited. Thus, the sculpture of an ancestor wearing a headdress made of a calabash bristling with porcupine quills attests to the status of great healer that this ancestor shares with the head of the household. Throughout his life, the guardian of the chambers of powers will fill it with objects related to his personal history, statues of ancestors and figurines made to commemorate an incident that affected him or a member of his household. Thus, the Chamber of Powers gradually transforms into a vast biographical palimpsest in which the image of the guardian ancestor watches over an assemblage of wooden and clay statues surrounded by a mass of various objects, witnesses to the vicissitudes of an existence. Throughout the Mande and Voltaic region, these statues are referred to by terms denoting shadow and reflection, images in their original sense, which give substance both to the deceased ancestor and to his descendants, who nevertheless are still alive and worship him. However, for the relationship between the ancestor and the descendant to be activated, it must be embodied in a form that is recognizable by the ancestor, as it is made in an identical style by the sculptors employed by the maternal clan. It is on condition that they can recognize themselves in the statues representing them that the ancestors agree to come and inhabit these images, which serve as sort of iconic dwellings for them. They are therefore both individuals, the double of a particular maternal ancestor, foreshadowing the destiny of his descendants, and archetypes that the latter must strive to conform to. It is easy to see how this little wooden person is the name that the Bambara called the ancestor statues, differ from animist images. While animist images incorporate the interiority of a non-human other activated on an ad hoc basis, the images of ancestors embody in a lasting way the fabric of social relations that connects the ancestor to his descendant and his relatives, making visible the status position they occupy, the ceremonial obligations incumbent upon them, and the reciprocal duties imposed on them. However, describing the statue as a little person indicates that it is more than a symbol, a memorial, or an illustrative sign. It is certainly an artifact, but one inhabited by a dead human being who lives on through it, imbued with an agency despite its apparent inertia, but an agency only perceptible through its effect. Prophylactic effects, when the ancestor protects his descendants from evils that may afflict them, vindictive effects when he fights their enemies, and restorative effects when he extends the mantle of forgiveness over them. The presence of the ancestor does not take the form of a sort of homunculus hidden in a statue, but of concrete results attributed to his physical embodiment. And if this ability to intervene as agents can be attributed to ancestors, it is because they are treated as agents within the collective. They do more than conform to the social rules that govern the relationship between the living and their ancestors. They engender and validate them. Ancestor statues may be static in the darkness of the chamber of powers, but they offer the eye a precious array of clues linking the past to the present, and together they form the fabric of affinities that give social life its stability and dynamism. Totems are a completely different kind of antecedents. In Australia at least, and most probably in other places, but I'll take Australia mainly as my case here, they perpetuate themselves by incorporating into new living beings, which each generation, rather than through genealogical continuity, passed on from descendants to descendants. That's the difference with ancestors precisely. The original incarnation occurred long ago, when these totemic entities, often bearing the names of animals and plants, but mainly animals, materialized on the surface of the earth as indescribable figures whose behavior was nevertheless very human. Like the Aborigines, they moved constantly from one place to another, camped, cooked, copulated, and sometimes fought each other. Perhaps because the term totem has come to be used in modern Western popular language to mean just about anything, the entities that have long been referred to by this term in anthropological literature are now more commonly called beings of the dream time, in reference to the period of the ordering of the world known in Aboriginal Australia as the dream time. Each totem, but I prefer to use the, even if it's polysemical now, I prefer to continue using the word totem. Each totem or being of the dream time can be seen as a prototype, endowed with unique physical and moral qualities that during the time, its time on Earth, interacted with other entities of the same nature before they all disappeared into the earth as suddenly as they had appeared, but leaving behind them, in the materiality of the landscape, the still visible traces of their actions: rock piles, riverbeds, water sources, groves, ochre deposits. The erasure of their first incorporation was therefore accompanied by a second incorporation in hollows, so to speak, since the topographical imprints left by these beings were molded by their anatomy and by their actions. A third incorporation results from the fact that, not content with giving shape to the landscape without reality planning it, the beings of the dreamtime, the totems, deposited seeds of individuation, spirit children, as they are called by anthropologists, in clearly identified sites which have since been embodied in each generation in the humans and non-humans of the totemic class from which each one originates. Let us add that the Aborigines regularly reactivate the reproductive fertility of these original prototypes through their ceremonies, not by invoking their presence in the form in which they once appeared, which in any case no one knows, but by displaying the traces left by their past actions, which are signs of their materiality. Thus, the Walpiri of Central Australia represent the totem known under the name of Night, Munga, in their Bamba ceremonies, not as one would do in an animist system for a spirit, that is, by means of a dancer disguised with a mask, costume, or adornment, but by tracing on the face, arms, and torso of the human figure representing the totem a sinuous line, an impression once left on the ground by the tail and penis of the prototype. Similarly, the dancer will wear a headdress made of feathers, which he will place on his head, and he will wear a mask made of a piece of cloth, which he will place on his face, and the arms and torso of the human figure representing the totem with a sinuous line represent the traces left in the ground by the prototype. No? So it's not iconic, it's indexical. Like most of the representation by which the beings of the dreamtime acquired physical existence, the first incorporation, if we go back to the life of these particular antecedents, the first incorporation corresponding to the emergence of totems on the surface of the earth is undefined, since the etiological narratives only mention the actions of these prototypes without specifying their appearances. The second incorporation, left by the imprints of the totems' bodies and behaviors in the landscape, is undoubtedly indexical. No? The third incorporation, which results from the repeated insemination of humans and non-humans by the spirit children of the beings of the dreamtime, is equally indexical, since the latter do not deposit a form in the beings they fertilize, but rather an essence that is both physical and moral, a kind of metaphysical DNA. And the last incorporation, which allows totems to be embodied in ceremonies, is again a matter of indexical figuration, since, as we have just seen, The humans who represent the beings of the dream time exhibit on their bodies not their appearance, which we do not know anyway, but the traces they have left behind. Art before art, or on its periphery, is neither primitive art, a clumsy and rudimentary precursor to European art, nor is it magical art, a mysterious expression of an immemorial soul, nor decorative art, a simplification into symbols of faded figurative power. It is first and foremost, as we have seen, that prodigious operation which, as Alberti wrote about painting, I quote Alberti, makes the absent itself present, so to speak. So to speak means a lot here. As this illustrious reference indicates, much of art itself also fits the definition. But what art before art, or beside art, accomplishes is to achieve this feat with means of expression that are very different from those developed by art. First, by multiplying the forms of embodiment and the types of embodied beings that art has long reduced to conventional objects, namely organisms, particularly human ones, tragic or edifying stories, and pieces of nature. All the invisible things brought into existence by the images we have reviewed introduce a diversity that makes the world fresher and more lovable, open at every moment to discovery. Images that have emerged outside the artistic tradition also know how to play with unexpected agencies which call upon faculties other than our ability to recognize a similarity between a representation and what it represents. Whether they twirl like a masked dancer in an American Indian village plaza, whether they flutter on the shoulders of their bearers on a path in the foothills of the Himalaya, whether they strike a hieratic pose in the heat of a Burkinabe ancestral shrine, or whether they fleetingly evoke the journey of a totem in the harsh light of Central Australia, all these images impose on those who interact with them the obvious force of their social coaction. They embody the invisible, no doubt, but they also give this invisible the ability to intervene in human affairs with a material configuration. And what invisible reality do contemporary images, art, since we must call it that, now embody? Like the images of art before art, the most original of today's creations are those that bring forth an indescribable, invisible reality, that is to say, something that words have not yet managed to tame, an invisible that bears witness to the confusion in the categories instilled by the Anthropocene, to the now manifest impossibility of continuing to separate into two watertight domains a world of concepts, conventions, and emotions, and a world of natural regularities. Among many others, two artists seem to me to perfectly illustrate this incorporation into images of invisible realities that we struggle to name. First, Olafur Eliasson, whose installations recreate seemingly natural phenomena without ever disguising the apparatus that makes this phenomena visible. One example is the Weather Project at the Tate Modern, which some of you may have seen a few years ago, which simulates a sunset in the mist, similar to what Turner had tried to depict not far away, but where the mechanisms of the illusion are revealed to the viewers. Or another one, which is Reversed Waterfall, a gravity-defying waterfall, because the water, as you can see, goes the other way, cascading skyward, exhibited for the first time in Seoul, where once again the hydraulic device enabling this counterintuitive phenomenon was revealed to view. Eliasson's work seemed to imitate nature, as European artists have done for centuries. But in reality, they reveal the artificiality of the arrangements that establishes nature as such, abolishing in a single movement the old distinction between nature and culture that has structured the modern world's presentation of the invisible through science and the arts. The same can be said of Pierre Huyghe's works. Olafur Eliasson is an Icelandic artist. Pierre Huyghe is French, but he is very cosmopolitan. I believe he lives in Chile now. His installation, Umwelt with the two U's to begin with, for example, which was first presented at the Serpentine Gallery in London. It's called After Umwelt. Is, as its name suggests, an environment, but an environment of a completely new kind and without equivalent in the natural world. It combines mental images that flash rapidly across screens, recreating the mental activity of a subject playing with images, triggered by external events, the action of bees, ants, and bacteria, while variations in the rhythm of the image's appearance are triggered by the division of cancer cells in an incubator. So images, organisms, biological functions, and technical devices thus combine to render visible in a random and constantly renewed manner an environment that is neither perfectly natural nor completely cultural, but suspended between modes of existence that we had long believed to be more compartmentalized. This is also the case in the short film, the short video, Human Mask, in which Pierre Huyghe shows a monkey wearing a mask inspired by the tradition of no theater and a long-haired wig, dressed as a young girl, wandering through a deserted and dilapidated restaurant, evocative of the evacuated area around Fukushima. The terribly disturbing coincidence between the character's youthful anthropomorphic loveliness and her strangely hairy limbs, her dismay in the post-nuclear ruins, and her adaptation to an environment that was not made for her, all this blurs with devastating effectiveness the long-standing boundaries in Western art between humanity and its non-human otherness. Incarnation, thus, as we can see, has taken on new forms, but this ongoing movement to objectify the invisible in images, I think, is not about to stop, and I wish it won't. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philippe. That was beautiful. We don't have much time, right, for questions, but we can take a few. I would say, since we talked about Christianity, I would say a trinity of questions, so 3 would be good. And then we'll see, tomorrow, if you speak French, well, you're welcome to join tomorrow morning. And if you don't speak French, on Saturday. So, questions? No questions? Yes, Peter. Peter has one here. No other questions? Tongam? And Yimi, we'll do that way. Peter, please.
First of all, thank you so much for this really illuminating lecture. I was struck by the fact that can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I was struck by the fact that you showed the veil of Veronica held by Veronica, this image of Christ, which is an imprint. And I was thinking that it is traditionally described as what is called, borrowing a Greek word from the Bible, what is called an acheiropoietic image. That is to say, an image not made by hands, that is to say, not made by hands, by human hands. And I was wondering, more generally, since you so convincingly speak about the outdated or questionable divide between nature and culture, how do you consider these images that are traditionally seen as not made by anybody, maybe made by nature, but still being images? And more generally, what place or what role would your anthropology of images, if we can call it so, give or reserve to these images that are oscillating between an artificial status as images and a natural status as products of nothing and no one?
Thank you, Petra. Maybe you take all the questions and then you respond. Is that okay? Tanga?
Yes, thank you so much. I have a more basic question, just sort of reframing for myself the moves that you're making in today's talk. So if I've understood correctly, the 4 different ontology or modes of world that you theorized in your book, Par-delà la nature et la culture, the naturalist, the animist, the analogical, and the totemist. This sort of this division into 4 ontologies is reaffirmed and re-explored through this anthropology of the image, where indeed you show us that each of these worlds or forms of worlding sort of has its own ways of making visible the invisible entities or invisible furnishings, to use your word, that compose it. So I guess I want to ask a simple question, which is, did this work on the image in particular change or modify any of your more theoretical propositions based on, ethnographic, but also sort of comparatist reflections in that first project? Is there anything about this particular study of particular images that displaced any of your insights? And then I guess, since you didn't directly but implicitly speak of the naturalist, or so-called sort of modern relationship to the invisible, and you did say towards the end that the invisible in our world, in our time, has become bears witness to the confusion of the Anthropocene. Beautiful formulation there. But can one say more generally, and are you saying in your book or now more generally that the naturalist amongst these four ontologies, the naturalist ontology has the most vexed form with the vexed relationship with the invisible, in the sense that modern science and technology have constantly been striving to minimize the place of the invisible. Again, an obvious question, and very long, sorry.
So maybe last question, Yimin? Go ahead. Thank you, Hanga.
Thank you very much for the talk. I want to ask one question. On this point that your talk has really inspired me to think about new ways about thinking about images. Because you have talked a lot about incarnations, embodiments, and how different forms of images participate in the community, how they embody a form of agency that participates in every day of life. It seems to me that you are referring to the image because, as in the traditional way of thinking about images, that they are kind of a reference. But it seems these modes of operations that you have presented is more of a generative process, in the sense that they create something that they cannot be captured simply by reference. So therefore, my question is really propice. It's very opportune that in one of the artwork that you have shown in the PowerPoint, the reversed waterfall. And then my question is kind of related to that. Is that whether when we are embodying or using images to make apparent the invisible, whether this kind of generative process is actually irreversible, as in whether once we bring the invisible forward, there is no going back, and then what is being made visible no longer participating in the invisible, and how that does that in fact challenges the concept that making images to figure the invisible actually endangers the invisible or undermines the invisible, because what we are doing is reversing a waterfall, and the contradictions inherent in that. Or do you think it's more of a positive? I shouldn't really use that word. Or is it more illuminating method also make present the invisible?
This would call for a whole seminar answering the three questions. Yes, I took the example of Veronica in order to pinpoint the importance of incarnation in European art. This obsession with incarnation that obviously has original religious properties. But the specific question you ask is a bit different from what I intended to show as a sort of atmospheric reference. The use of self-made images is interesting in the sense that it's a specific way of revealing the invisible. I'm thinking of the importance of Betulé, these monolith, that represented in the Near East, and even quite late in Greece, deity, and we have the specificity of being monolith, and at the same time that is not man-made artifacts, but which are the abode, and there are cases like that in other parts of the world. I'm thinking of examples in Polynesia, for instance, or in Western Africa. these objects embody an invisible presence because they are as I said, I'm using this metaphor that Alfred Gell had proposed of the embassy or the representative of a country, no? Represent in the sense of a diplomat. They represent not, of course, in an iconic perspective, not even in an indexical way, but as being the abode of an agency that is supposed to reside in this non-artifact, in this natural thing. Huacas in the Andes, monoliths, have also this same characteristic, no? And so well, there is another aspect into which I will not enter now, which are paraidolic images, no? The things that you discern in the forms of clouds, or the vegetation, etc., which give rise to a form of embodiment, which is also different in the sense that they are not man-made artifacts, but they support a form of embodiment of something in a visible form. I'll stop at that. I will also answer quickly, but what I became aware of, I was interested in working on images because in my book, the Beyond Nature and Culture, I developed this model which you mentioned, basically based on discursive material, texts of all kinds, and I was eager to see whether it's robust enough to work also in a non-discursive context, that is with images. And of course I started using the kind of images that are associated with the kind of polities that have produced the discourses that I use as testimonies of one or the other forms of ontological regime. But progressively, I left that aside when I became aware both of I was conscious of the question of hybridity before, no? That is, some polities are examples of a combination of an arrangements between two ontological regimes, and there are many cases like that in images, and images reveal perhaps this hybridity better than discursive material. That is the chapter in my the book that will be issued shortly in English on the Tsimshian of the Pacific coast, the Northwest Pacific coast, tries to understand how the production of images which have the same reference, they are in fact can be dissociated between animist and totemic images by a series of conditions. And in fact, it was a clue for understanding better some contradictions that I was aware of in reading the material on Northwest, on culture of the Northwest coast, which appear to exhibit at some times very animist features, and at other times very totemist features. And working on images allowed me to have a clearer vision, precisely, of the nature of the differences there was in social life that drew upon one regime or the other. Another thing which became very clear for me was, of course, the fact that images, changes in ontological regimes are foreshadowed by a change in images. And this became very clear, of course, for the emergence of naturalism, which appears in images as early as the 15th century, but is not thematized until the 17th century in the text of the Greek, of the philosophers and scientists of that time. And so images have this peculiarity of pinpointing to something, a new ways of worlding, and this is why I concluded on contemporary artists, no? Because we are still. This is something you mentioned my connection with Bruno Latour over the years, and this is something we have been discussing. It seemed to us, and Bruno was very close to the work of Olafur Eliasson. I'm closer to the work of Pierre Huyghe. We were both convinced that among contemporary artists, there was an expression of something that was going on, that was a change in ontological regime that we were unfortunately unable to pinpoint and thematize. No, I wouldn't know if it's a fifth ontology or whether it's an hybridization. So images were important in that respect. No. Finally, well, the question. Among the many reasons I started working on images was, of course, my reading of Alfred Gell's book Art and Agency, and then of all the art historians like Hans Belting or Horst Bredekamp, who emphasized the fact that images were beyond what they have been for art history for a long time, that is, symbols or signs of social and cultural features. There were also active mechanisms within agency that made them part of the social life of humans. And so one of the things I tried to do in that book I was mentioning was precisely not only to explore how some kinds of images are revealing of a specific ontological regime, but also of the fact that each ontological regime, and perhaps if this book is has some purchase, it's on this aspect, that each ontological regime has a form of or involves a form of agency that is specific to it. Because the discussion among art historians and among anthropologists also as to where does this agency of images come from is usually alternates between we don't know, or there's a Horst Bredekamp has answered by saying it's the image act. No, it's a sort of like an Austinian power of images in itself, or whether it's That's the position of Friedberg. It's a cognitive mechanism that is proper to humanity, etc. I think that there are different forms of agency of images, and these different forms are predicated on the type of ontological regime within which they flourish or they were created. So there are different forms of rendering of. Well, the question you ask is a very tricky one, because of course once the thing has been made visible, what remains of the invisible? I think there's a huge part of world experience which is frustrated because we cannot render visible things that we would like to render visible. So the amount of invisible things or elements of the world remains mind-boggling, no? So, and also, I won't enter into that, no, but in one of the chapters, I begin with a quotation by Maurice Merleau-Ponty, which is where he talks about the doublure d'invisible, a lining of invisible, no? That each images reveals a lining of invisible, and this was a source of inspiration, no? What is this lining of invisible that an image reveals? So I think it's an open question, and it's an open field of investigation still, of course.